Actually, today is Wednesday, the 9th of May, and we are having here a presentation today about the main survey results of the best practices under the Organization and Documentation of Best Practices Initiative, INT 0085. By the end of last week, TCQS had a distinguished visitor speaking of knowledge quality, and he has emphasized a couple of aspects of interest. One of them is preservation of knowledge, which goes through generation, so it is a matter of documentation of knowledge. The other aspect that was emphasized by His Excellency Dr. Ali Saidi, the former TC Director, is the management of knowledge through networking. And this is an aspect of organization which goes back, both of them, the preservation and the management, into the organization and documentation of best practices we're talking about today. Our presentation today is composed of 5 parts, 5 little sections. The first one is who submitted the survey, the best practices survey. The second is what is being submitted. And the third part is quick observations about the survey submissions. And the fourth, where are we at the moment, at which stage in the initiative, in the implementation of the initiative. And we will close this presentation by what's next beyond the situation we are in at the moment. Under the first header, who submitted the best practices survey, we will cover a few aspects. There are just few slides about the regions, the distribution of regions, and the countries that were involved in the submission, the stakeholders, and gender distribution, and finally the language used in the submissions. The first statistic, and all what will be exposed in the following slides are factual issues relating to the submissions. Okay, so we have received in TCQS, TCPC, 40 best practice submissions from the different regions. And we have received mainly from 3 regions and the Secretariat. The top rater was Latin America, followed by Europe, Asia and Pacific, and we had a submission from IAA Secretariat. The participant countries who joined with TC in the submissions of best practices are 18 plus the IAA Secretariat. Topped was Mexico with 9 submissions of best practices, followed by Chile, Argentina, and then we moved to Croatia in Europe, and then Macedonia and China assumed the same position. Something very interesting concerning the stakeholders who participated in the submissions of best practices is that this bar, the counterparts, topped the submissions, the participation in submissions, and they accounted around 41% of the entire submissions of 40. This was followed by, interestingly as well, Cooperation Regional Agreement Chairs and Coordinators by 13%, equal to others. And by others we had categories like academic professors, research officers, etc. With respect to gender, one more interesting feature is that the distribution between male and female submitters is almost even, with 53% for males and 48% for females. The language of submission, at the beginning, if you recall, we have had discussions in the several stakeholders workshop that took place here in IAA headquarters with the different stakeholders, and we have said that language should not be a hindrance to any exchange of knowledge. So actually we have received in TCQS 37 submissions in English, and the only other than English language was Spanish. Now we move move to the second section. What was submitted in the best practices? And under this, we have 4 subheaders. The type of submission, whether it is joint or individual. The second is the word count, which we have specified in the guidelines to be a maximum of 1,000 words excluding spaces. And the field of activities in order to identify the themes, which is the second classification we have promised to offer. And the final is the categories which are generated from the key principles that are contained in the core of best practice in the design of TC projects and programs. Paper. What was submitted? One of the interesting features in the best practices exercise and mechanism, which makes it quite distinctive from the success stories initiative that is in place as well in TC, is the feature of teamwork, the joint submissions. Joint submissions, out of the 40 best practices that we have received, we have found them to be around 30%. This is quite an interesting breakthrough and an important point to highlight. As for the number of words, as I said at the beginning of this subsection, we have had in the best practices survey guidelines a maximum limit of 1,000 words excluding spaces. So we have worked out slightly with the figures and the submissions that we had. We found submissions that range between 1 word and 500 words, which is the maximum in this range, were 33 out of 40 submissions. 500 words to 1,000 words were 4 submissions, and beyond the 1,000 were 3. We have found that maximum number of words were 1,276. The minimum number of words for a single submission best practice was 45, so the average was 349, which we hope is not a heavy burden on the selection committee in the upcoming phase. Now, going to the fields of activities, again, an interesting finding from the results of the submissions that we have received so far is that the field of activities that have been covered in the submissions were 8 out of 10 of IEA's fields of activities, except for nuclear chemistry and radiochemistry, and radiation, medicine, and health. You may be intrigued about this category, the 12 submissions under the unidentified. The unidentified are those submissions that relate, for example, to regional agreement or to any management category in the field of best practice, which does not comply with any of the fields of activities. Again, one of the distinguishing features of our exercise, the best practices exercise, is that the best practices are prepared and generated vis-a-vis or compared to a benchmark. And our benchmark here is the quality criteria applied in TC. 114 ticks in the survey were on the quality criteria, and they are 114, which is bigger than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the 6 criteria that we have identified in the survey, because some of the submissions tick more than one quality criteria. But overall, we have found from the results that efficiency topped the quality criteria that has been ticked, and followed equally by sustainability and effectiveness. Then follows relevance, ownership, and under others, some submitters have pointed to areas of opportunity and development and so on and so forth. Now moving to the final sub-item under what is being submitted in the best practices are the categories that were contained, the 7 categories that were contained in the survey. And those are the country program framework, the program cycle management, log frame methodology, coordination arrangements, regional and inter-regional cooperation, partnerships, and project results. Log frame methodology topped the hits and was followed by project cycle management and country program framework. The following slides that we will be flipping quite quickly are the categories that we have just summarized and the subcategories that are contained within the survey. So let's see. This is the second subcategory, the third, fourth, and fifth, sixth, partnerships, and finally, project results. Okay, towards the end of the survey itself, we may need to share a few observations. We have pointed in the survey some guiding phrases or sentences to assist the submitters in the preparation of their write-up. So some of the features that we have asked for is to write a short description of the best practice, define as clearly as possible the problem or issue that is being handled, how was the issue addressed and who addressed it, what was the approach and methodology that was utilized, how effective was it, the types of lessons learned, the quality criteria, and who benefited from the results of the best practice, and were there any special constraints or any special information that needs to be shared in order to make this proposed best practice applicable and replicable and so on. So our very quick observations on the submissions is as follows. As you would imagine, there would be a spectrum relating to the quality of submissions, and this is actually our personal assessment. You would have a variety of best practices at the top line or the upside of quality, and others not so much. So on the upside, we have found submissions, and this is the upside was really the majority of the submissions that we have received out of the 40 best practices in the first round. They were very well focused. They provided evidence into the arguments that are being forwarded. They have used the template that we have provided, the survey template, and by this they have ticked all the necessary information that we needed and asked for, and they abided by the word limit, the maximum of 1,000. And they have explained the terminology that they have used, whether technical or management or whatever. And they have selected the correct quality criteria relevant to the BEP or the best practice submitted. They have identified clearly and possibly under a subheader the lessons learned for possible replication. They were objective in the use of language, scientific, simple, and accessible. And towards the end of their best practice, they have identified the limitations that constrain any type of replication in any other region or in any other country. However, looking at the other side of the coin and looking at the downside, we have seen some best practice submissions that speak of what is hoped for, okay? Like, for example, a project has followed a specific methodology or a criteria, and they hope that in the future something would happen. It's something normative, it's something expected. It may happen for sure, and it may not happen. So this is something questionable, and we can hardly take it as a replicable best practice. The other thing is that some of the submissions were recommendations like, we would like to see this happening, or we would like to see that happening. Perhaps this is again questionable. whether this is the right recommendation in the specific context and situation or not. Few have not used the template that we have all agreed on, the survey template, and accordingly they have missed out on many of the important assessment criteria that will be used by the selection committee. They have used terminologies without mentioning what did they stand for, and they assume that everyone knows this terminology, but this is not necessarily the case. They may have ticked all the quality criteria, and in fact they may have handled one or two. Okay, so this is a point to note. As well, in very limited number of best practice submissions, we have noticed that the submitter have some kind of misunderstanding between the quality criteria that we are using for our submissions, the best practices, and the quality standards like ISO and so on and so forth. This is slightly different. Others used a bit of complimentary notes thanking a specific stakeholder and another stakeholders. Perhaps this is compared to the other sub-item in the other side, the upside, which is the use of scientific rather than objective and simple and approachable language. And the final note that we have observed as well from the best practice submissions is that they have used the template in the submission of 2 or 3 best practices. In the survey filling guidelines, we have mentioned that any candidate or candidates who are jointly submitting a best practice must be using a single template in order not to confuse the criteria and to make the life of the selection committee harder. And now, where are we? Where do we stand? I'm just taking this slide from a presentation that we have shared together last November 2011 here in IEA, where a number of stakeholders, in-house stakeholders, were attending with TCQS. And we have discussed that the Best Practices Initiative has 13 major milestones. It has started last August 2011, with internal consultations about the mechanism within the quality assurance section, and with the director of TC and the regional directors and the senior associates, and was presented to the RCA, and several consultations with the PM, with the technical cooperation department and technical departments, and again with the regions. And now we are standing here in the blue star, the selection process. We have received, compiled, organized, the survey submitted, and now it's about time to get into selection before going to dissemination phases and sustaining the initiative and mainstreaming it within TC operations. Okay, in a nutshell, the main phases to complete the selection process for the first round, which is a pilot process for the time being. We are testing the selection process. So it is now being composed of 5 steps. The first is the formation and the composition of the selection committee. The second is the submission of the questionnaires received after being coded and blinded for the selection, the independent selection by the selection committee, or I would better put it, the independent rating of the submitted best practices. And then the selection committee of best practices will convene either physically or virtually for further validation and agreement on the mode of announcement. And after then, the final stage in the selection process would be to announce the top raters that have been validated and agreed by the selection committee of best practices. If we have a quick look on the timeline that we are thinking about, and it is actually excerpted from the meeting held here with the stakeholders early this year in January, and it is as follows. For round one, the selection committee formed with invitation sent to the members of the committee sometime probably in the third week of May 2012. Then the field questionnaire coded, blinded and received by the best practice selection committee again towards the end of May 2012. The third step, BP's independent rating completed, and the best practices facilitator and focal point consolidate the case-by-case results, okay, because each selection committee member will be reviewing the entire set of best practices submitted, and after then they will be collated and compiled and organized and analyzed and put in a consolidated report after then to be submitted to the selection committee for validation in June 2012. And finally, as was agreed again, the rating announcement will be by the selection committee, the best practices selection committee, sometime during, hopefully, in the first half of July this year. Again, what's next? We've been done now with the selection process, but we have had a number of key milestones in our roadmap for the best practices mechanism, or the organization and documentation of best practices initiative. We have been through the best practices quality criteria for validation, the peer review process, the draft design for consolidation and compilation of best practices, the design, validation and facilitation of inter-regional best practices workshop, and plenty of activities have been taken already. We are here at the selection process. We are awaiting the dissemination mechanisms and documentation, and finally developing the important and key tools in order to sustain the best practices mechanism into the future. And by this is the last slide. Thank you very much for your attention.